Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, how is plastic pollution changing our oceans? One Pawcatuck, Connecticut artist is working alongside scientists to depict the interweaving of the synthetic and natural world. Artist Elizabeth Ellenwood joins us in a few minutes. First, the candidates running in the 5th Congressional District met for a Connecticut public debate last night at Central Connecticut State University. Incumbent Democrat Jahana Hayes faces a challenge by former state Senator George Logan, a Republican. Now, the 5th is the most competitive House seat in the state. More than $5 million of outside money has flowed into this race, reports the Connecticut Mirror. Abortion rights and the economy were just some of the issues that came up last night. For analysis, joining us now on Zoom is Dr. Bilal Sekou, Hillyer College Associate Professor of Politics and Government at University of Hartford. Bilal, welcome back to the show.
Good morning, Lucy.
Our listeners can join as well, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Bilal, I know you were watching. This was the last of Connecticut Public's debate series, and I think the second debate between these two candidates this week. Probably the last time these opponents will face off before Election Day. What were your takeaways?
Well, I think last night's debate was interesting on a number of levels. I mean, one, clearly there is a contrast between the candidates, a fairly sharp contrast on a number of issues ranging from, their discussion about the Biden-Harris record, single party control of Congress, issues like abortion, gun control, and a range of other sort of hot button cultural issues. And so I think this debate clearly means that voters have a choice.
Well, you mentioned abortion. That definitely came up, as you said, and Hayes said she would absolutely vote yes if there was a federal vote codifying abortion rights. Her opponent, Logan, said he would not support a bill aimed at codifying Roe v. Wade in federal law, going on to say the decision was made by the U.S. Supreme Court. Then he goes on to say, I will do everything in my power to make sure that a woman's right to choose is in no way infringed from what we have in Connecticut. Hayes then addressed a consistent talking point around late-term abortions that George Logan has brought up. She's making a major clarification here. Let's take a listen.
They keep going unchecked, saying his opponent supports late-term abortions and parental notification. What I support is codifying the language of Roe, which says that up to viability and beyond that in the good faith consultation with the medical professional. That means exactly what I said. The decision is between a woman and her doctor. When we talk about parental notification, at the point where a 15, 16, 17-year-old finds themselves in that position, something at home is most likely already disrupted, and they need to be able to seek help. I was pregnant at 17. This idea that you have to get someone at home to sign off or allow you to get help presupposes that you come from a two-parent supportive household. That is not the case for everyone.
So, Bilal, what did you think of that exchange and this major clarification that Jahana Hayes made last night?
Yeah, and I think it was actually one of the stronger moments for her during the debate in which she, really tried to clarify where she stands on this issue. I thought the other point she made that I found really fascinating was this question around how, she's pro-choice. And one of the things she said about this notion of states, for example, making the decision to allow abortion or not allow. And she says, look, essentially individual states making that decision is not choice. And so I think that was a very strong statement on her part. Less clear to me was where exactly Logan stands on this with regard to, the issues she's raised about the Roe standard. It's not altogether clear. I know nationally for Republicans, they've talked a lot about finding a so-called middle ground in which rape and incest would be, those things in which abortions would be allowed. But that's really a quite minimal sort of standard compared to, I think, what really is at stake with the Dodd decision.
Another question that came up fairly early in the debate was on the issue of rights of trans athletes to compete. George Logan and Jahana Hayes differ quite on this issue. Logan takes a hard stance. Jahana noted that on several other issues, her opponent deferred to the state, but not on trans rights. What was your reaction there?
again, I think a really interesting moment in the debate. And I listened very closely to what Logan said. And I was struck by when he differentiated between, saying that he doesn't believe in discrimination, but he was very clear. And I think if you listen closely to what he said, he talked about transgender athletes, and he used the pronoun male, competing with females or competing with girls. And he was consistent in framing it that way. And I think that says a lot, probably where his position is at, really, I think, on this issue of transgender women. And, and clearly the difference between the two candidates really stood out on that.
We've been hearing from Republicans about the issues that they think that their constituents are most concerned about. That, of course, is the economy. And then there was a shift when Logan gave a rebuttal on inflation to touch on immigration and the opioid crisis. Let's hear it.
And what about the opioid epidemic? I mean, time is winding down here. We need to talk about that. We need to secure our southern borders. We need to control the inflow of fentanyl. My opponent hasn't said a word about it. I want to focus on issues that are important to the people of the 5th Congressional District. And the opioid epidemic is high on the list. Why hasn't my opponent done more to be a voice for us regarding the southern border? Why does she bring the Vice President of the United States of America here and not ask her, what's the plan to secure our southern borders? What's the plan to tackle inflation?
Jahana Hayes then replied, is there no opioid epidemic in the 3rd district? Perhaps making this larger point that her opponent can't say every national issue doesn't matter to the 5th. So what stood out to you there, Bilal?
Yeah, again, I think this was that moment where Logan was really trying to, elevate this issue that I think is really working for Republicans, this issue around crime in the broader sense. And certainly the opioid crisis has been a crisis that has really hit the nation hard. And it's been that way for a number of years. And so it wasn't a surprise that he tried to do that. I mean, it's clear from the debate, what Logan was attempting to do was to make this a real referendum on the Biden-Harris administration, and also linking Pelosi and single party control of Congress, and making the case that Democrats have really failed to deal with some of those core issues that are affecting American families, like the opioid crisis, issues like inflation, issues like, just the cost of food at grocery stores. And it was interesting because I think Hayes clearly was there to defend the Biden-Harris agenda and to defend what Congress has produced under Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. And so a lot of their back and forth about various sort of programs and various pieces of legislation that have passed, I think was really interesting because it really drew a sharp contrast between Logan's position that a lot of this is excessive spending, that a lot of this is not really focused on the real kinds of issues, and Hayes really making the case that this is actually dealing with the kind of pocketbook issues, whether it's or issues that people in her district and across the country care about, such as mental health and other kinds of issues that came up during the debate.
You're hearing Dr. Bilal Sekou, Hillyer College Associate Professor of Politics and Government and University of Hartford, as we talk about this 5th Congressional District debate held last night on the campus of Central Connecticut State University. If you were watching, if you live in the 5th, we'd love to hear your observations as Election Day draws near. 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Bilal, when we think about all the issues that you've raised and the 5th Congressional District being the most competitive, do you feel like the issues about people's pocketbooks will be what will bringing them to the polls, or more about these social issues that we heard at the top of the debate?
Yeah, well, the conventional wisdom, among political scientists who study elections is that pocketbook issues, are first and foremost in the minds of voters, certainly with the problem of inflation and real uncertainty about whether we're in a recession or heading to a recession will certainly mean that these issues will be front and center. What's really, I think more curious a question I ask is whether some of the cultural issues that are playing out in other parts of the country, like critical race theory, for example, or transgender rights, will really be those kind of issues that will move voters and bring them to the polls in a way that they may perhaps be more impactful in some of the more conservative states, and particularly in the South and in the upper Midwest. And so, I mean, it's a real question about what will exactly stick. But I think clearly Logan's effort that night, he returned to it, where he may not have had a great deal of depth in terms of talking about what exactly he would support and call for. He really wanted to make this about the Biden Harris, administration and their failures to deal with real issues that affect Connecticut voters. And as I said before, Hayes's, position was to defend that record and to defend her record and her part she's played in helping to vote for and support those things that she thinks are really important to the 5th District and that she's brought back, whether it's money for infrastructure or money for mental health or other kinds of issues that affect people in that district.
So we've talked about how issues surrounding people's pocketbooks will bring them to the polls. When we hear about the conversations around crime, again, Logan linking opioids and immigration, is that part of this larger Republican playbook? Is crime another issue, Bilal, that will bring people towards to the polls on November 8th?
Absolutely. I think over the last couple of years, we saw an uptick in homicides, though nationally, other statistics have not shot up in that way. Connecticut has also talked about how crime is not as high as it was. We're nowhere near some of the historic highs we hit in the past. And yet the perception, especially in the suburbs and also among many residents who live in central cities who are seeing homicide rates go up, is that crime is a problem, if not out of control. And so Republicans are pushing hard on that issue and really making the case that, people are not safer under this administration. I mean, it links to also the gun issue as well. I mean, I think, there was a real sharp contrast between Hayes and Logan. Hayes is in favor of a federal ban on assault weapons, returning that ban, and also doing more with regard to background checks. And of course, Logan opposes the federal ban. And in that sense, I mean, again, voters have a real contrast between the candidates.
As a political scientist, we've talked about some of the issues, but when you're watching these two candidates, again, how they perform under pressure, obviously you have an incumbent and then a former state senator who before this race, maybe a lot of people didn't know unless it was the district that George Logan was representing. And so what did you think about that performative part of debates and how they both did?
Yeah, I think that, both of them clearly, came there to project a certain kind of image and to push the issues that they cared about in a certain way. Hayes has the advantages of being the sitting, member of Congress. And so I thought she demonstrated a much deeper sort of ability to talk about the issues and to really break down pieces of the legislation that has moved through Congress and Biden has signed into law, and was able to describe those things in a way that Logan really didn't have that kind of depth. And I think that's purely a reflection of the fact that he's not there actually, making the laws and really doing the sausage making, as they like to say. And so that clearly came out. But then he had a message and he stayed on message. He stayed on point, which was really, as I said before, to make that case that, the Biden administration has failed the country and that there needs to be a change, that single party rule in Congress hurts the country, that he would be someone who would go there and be bipartisan and would work across, the aisle with Democrats to try to get things done. Hayes, of course, responded that in order to get things done, without support from Republicans in Congress, and she checked off those various issues in which Republicans voted no on legislation the Democrats were advancing, that single party sort of rule or dominance is really the only way to get things done.
Last up, I had mentioned this is a pretty close race according to the polls. That might have to do with all the money being poured into the 5th District, outside money, Bilal, I believe more than $5 million. So I'm curious your thoughts on that. And what do you expect to see in the last 2.5 weeks before Election Day in this race?
One of the things that has struck me about the ads that have run, and I saw one this morning that was quite negative, that actually came out of the Hayes campaign, is just how negative a number of these ads have been. And so a lot of that outside money, of course, is pushing what I think are very negative ads and not really saying enough about what the candidates would do once they get into office or return to office. And so I think in many ways it's a disservice to voters because they don't really hear a strong case being made about here are the issues and here's the way in which I would address those issues if I had the opportunity to do that. And so I imagine in the next several weeks, Republicans really feel like this is a seat that they could potentially pick up as they, really make their effort to gain majority status in the House. And so I think we're going to see even more money come in and a round of ads, hitting us over the air and quite negative ads, over the next few weeks.
You've been hearing Dr. Bilal Sekou, Hillyer College Associate Professor of Politics and Government at University of Hartford. Always a pleasure to hear from you, Bilal. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Take care. Lucy. Why did I say Nancy? Thinking about Pelosi.
It was a long night. Oh no, you didn't go there. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. I want to give props to Frankie Graziano, who moderated that debate last night at Central Connecticut State University. Coming up after a short break, we're going to pivot from politics to pollution. Connecticut artist Elizabeth Ellenwood has been working alongside scientists researching how plastic pollution is changing our oceans. It's the focus of a book called Interweaving of the Synthetic and Natural World and an upcoming photography exhibit. We learn more. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. How is plastic pollution changing our oceans? Elizabeth Ellenwood is an artist from Pawcatuck, Connecticut, who explores this pressing question through her art, capturing images of ocean pollution that are beautiful and conceptually shocking. Ellenwood is back in Connecticut after working alongside scientists at the Norwegian Geotechnical Institute as a Fulbright scholar, ultimately producing a book and a photography series titled The Interweaving of the Synthetic and Natural World. She joins us now ahead of the U.S. debut of her Interweaving exhibit. Elizabeth Ellenwood, welcome back to the show.
Good morning, Lucy. Thank you so much for having me.
Our listeners can join as well, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. We spoke to you for just a short time several months ago, but you were in Norway working with environmental chemists and marine biologists to create this book and a photo series. And that, again, is titled The Interweaving of the Synthetic and Natural World. That will be on display at UConn's Avery Point campus on November 3rd. So how did this all get started, Elizabeth?
I would say my interest in it started when I was in graduate school at the University of Connecticut, and I was working on my thesis. And that's kind of when I started working with bringing my interest of the ocean and a lot of just like my upbringing of being around the water and wanting to do more conservation work, and then mixing it with my photography and art background. And so I really enjoyed combining these two interests in my life. So I started looking into how else I could work with art as communication. And so I looked into the Fulbright program. And it's a really amazing program. I highly encourage anyone to look into the Fulbright in case you want to go to a different country and study with other people. So I started looking into it probably in 2019. I think I started researching how to make a project based about ocean and science and art. And I emailed Hans Peter Arp through the Norwegian Geotechnical Institute, and it was like kind of amazing how quickly and easily it came together after emailing him. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Hans Peter Arp. So he's a chemistry professor at the Norwegian Geotechnical Institute. So tell us a little bit about him and then the process of working with him. He's a scientist. You're an artist.
Yeah, and he's a really, really cool person. It was really great. So I pretty much sent him an email back in 2019 that was like, hey, this is who I am. This is kind of the project I'm looking into doing. And he responded pretty quickly and was like, I love this idea of art and science working together and science communication. I think it's great. So I applied for the Fulbright, and he wrote a really wonderful letter of recommendation. And then everything kept getting postponed, right? Because I was supposed to be there in 2020. And then we all know what's been going on for the past couple of years. So everything kept getting kicked back, but we kept emailing about like our projects that we were doing or just like things of interest. So when I arrived, we kind of had this approach of just sharing resources and having conversations of things that we were interested in. And I started making images in the lab, and I just started sending him photographs of what I was making. And we had this connection of he was working on writing and research about, you know, how plastic and nature are turning into this new thing, right? You can't really easily separate it. And I was making these photographs that really visually showed it. So that's kind of how the book kind of organically started through an email, actually, of like an email chain back and forth of here are these images, here's this conversation of writing about how we're both seeing it in our work in different ways. So that was really great. And working with him and his team were just absolutely amazing people and just like really excited about what they're studying, which is hard because it's pollution, right? So it's like very sad and depressing, but these scientists are they're very good at what they do, and they're really good at remaining like positive about it in a way, which I was kind of shocked by. Like everyone was like, yeah, and then you keep asking questions and you keep researching and then you just keep going. So that was really great. It was really great to be a part of.
And you're focusing on microplastics, also known as, I guess, nurdles. And so this idea of something that, you know, is invisible to a lot of us, but it's there and it's impacting our marine ecosystems. And so why it was so important to have this collaboration when we think about, you know, what scientists are uncovering and ways to make it more accessible, Elizabeth?
Right, exactly. And the nurdles you actually can see with like, you know, you can just pick them up and see them. And I was finding them on the beach. And so for those that don't know what a nurdle is, which sounds really cool, but it's actually a plastic pellet, which is considered the primary plastic, right? It's like the building blocks of what you need before you make the bottles or the plastic objects or things like this. So like it hasn't even been made into what it's going to be for its life. And it's still ending up in our environment. So I found those on a beach in Oslo, and it was just kind of by accident. I was sitting in the sand and I just was poking around in the sand, and I started to find all these perfectly shaped circles, which are the nurdles. And I realized they were plastic, and I had read about them before. So I took a photo and I sent an email to Hans Peter, and I was like, why am I finding all these nurdles here? And he sent me some resources of some shipping containers that were transporting all of these plastic pellets, which is very common and happens everywhere in the world. And what happens is they can get damaged and they leak into the ocean, and then they end up on the beaches. They end up, you know, a bunch of fish eat them. Like it's very sad, but they're so small that like they are like, they look really appetizing to a tiny fish because they look like they should be food. So those you can see, but the other ones that you're looking under the microscope, it's really incredible to then see all of these small fibers and fragments that you can't see with your normal vision. And it's something that needs to be shown and talked about so we can kind of understand it more, right? Yeah.
Our listeners can get an idea of some of the images that you've captured. Again, Elizabeth Ellenwood, just go to our website, ctpublic.org/where we live. So in this interweaving series, you've isolated these nurdles, which you've described for us, and we see these portraits in a grid throughout your book. So tell us more about the photo series, and can you describe some of your work?
Yeah, so the book kind of goes throughout different images that are both taken in the lab through a microscope, but also I call them my in the field photographs. So in the natural environment, just going around and seeing the pollution just out in the landscape. And I think it's really important to include both, because you don't really know what you're looking at sometimes in the book. So it kind of makes you question, is this really big? Is this really small? And I like playing with that in my image making, because the pollution issues are big and they are small, and they're very important to think about. And then to also see moments where you think that the plastic pollution can be easily separated, right? There's a spread in the book that's got a water bottle on a bunch of rocks and some seaweeds entangled. And then on the other side of the page, there's another water bottle. So they look very similar, but they both were taken in different areas, but the pollution is the same. So I'm kind of trying to like hint at the multi-level problem that we encounter, right? So it's like same pollution, different countries. Could it be separated? You kind of think it can be, and then you go throughout the book and start to see really that interweaving and that combination that's starting to happen, where like the plastic and the like natural matter is just kind of becoming one tangled mess, which is really fascinating.
There's another great example of what you've just described. The image is of a small teapot-shaped piece of what looks like earth or turf or trash, covered in part by this bright green piece of plastic. So when you look at it, it's really striking. It's also a really beautiful, the image that you've captured. But at the same time, when we think about the impact again on our oceans, it can be horrifying. So tell us about this image that you captured and what you want people to think about when they're looking at it.
Yeah, that image is actually one of the first ones that I made in the lab, and it's from a compost study that the scientists were doing. So it's about food waste, right? So it's like that green bag that green piece that you see is actually a plastic bag that all the food waste is being collected in Oslo. And so it's kind of becoming a part of this organic material where they're trying to look at the compost and see how much plastic is kind of ending up there, and then ask all those questions and see what the solutions are for either separating it, but also like, you know, maybe not using plastic bags to collect all the food waste is also an option. But I think you mentioned how it's beautiful. I think it's really, really important for me to make work that has some sense of beauty, because it can get a little depressing to continually photograph trash and pollution. Mm-hmm. So for one reason, I make images that are beautiful, because I definitely need to remain hopeful myself. But I also think that we tend to look at things a little bit longer if they're beautiful. So I want to make work in a way that invites people in with this beauty, and then you kind of get to start thinking more about what the actual object is and what your relationship to the problem is. So it's this little trick that I also like using of like, come look at this, it's beautiful. Now I want you to think about it though, and what else could it be? And how else can we help this situation?
How do people respond when you describe the work that you've been doing, Elizabeth? When they hear that you're an artist, you know, and your work is your photography, and thinking about, you know, what people might perceive as what those are taking pictures of, but you're taking pictures, as you mentioned, of trash, and again, this larger point about what is happening to our oceans, our marine ecosystem. So, what are the reactions you get?
Yeah. So, you know, initially when I say I'm a photographer, a lot of people are like, oh, so like you photograph weddings. And I'm like, definitely not. That's not my subject matter. Like that's a very great thing to do, but like I can't photograph people. So I definitely am not in that realm. And then I start to kind of describe what I do. And then at some point I bluntly am like, I photograph trash that I collect on the beach. And like, that's pretty, you know, you can understand it a little bit more. And then it creates this great conversation of like, oh my gosh, I read this article about, plastics in air and plastics in the snow and all of these things. So usually people like this conversation just keeps going, which is really great. And that's something that I love about communication, but also about collaboration. So you can start to like meet people through these conversations and be like, okay, so what are your skills and thoughts about this? And then let's get together and share skill sets and make things hopefully, make the world a better place. So everyone's been pretty responsive, which is really great.
Again, you're hearing Elizabeth Ellenwood here where we live, talking about her book and upcoming photography exhibit titled The Interweaving of the Synthetic and Natural World. There's more information on our website about that exhibit at ctpublic.org/wherewelive. Some of the other photography in this book, you played with scale in a two-page spread that's actually fairly early on in the book. On the left, we're looking through a microscope, and on the right, onto a speck of styrofoam on the shore. Talk about the way you've captured this.
Yeah, that one's great. You're talking about the one that kind of looks like a moonscape, right? Like like it looks a little like space, which I thought was fun. Yeah. So what I started to notice, and this was kind of by accident, was what I was seeing in the lab, I also was seeing out in the field and in the landscape. So like all of my shapes and my colors were starting to reference one another, and it wasn't on purpose, but it was more when I was sitting down and looking at all the images together that I saw this like collaboration between scale, right? So it's like this thing is ridiculously small and tiny, and then this landscape is, you kind of can't tell what size it is. So when I was looking at making a book, it really made sense to me to start playing with that scale even more and kind of, walking people through these images and being like, the shapes are similar. You kind of can't tell what's going on. But I want you to think about it a little bit longer. I want you to stare at the page a little bit longer and have your own reactions to it. And the styrofoam is really incredible, but really deadly to the environment as well. It's this idea of small and large, and like the pollution issues are also can be down to the tiny, 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 tiny scale as well as ridiculously large. So, yeah.
You also chose orange as a color for the book, and I'm wondering if you can describe that. It was an intentional decision. Tell us about that.
Because you see a lot of the plastic things that are made are very bright and bold, they're eye-catching, right? So like you kind of have this like almost fake color that we tend to like gravitate towards and see. So I really loved that idea of having an orange book cover. Also because orange is also alarming, right? So you kind of think about it and you're like, okay, something's up here. And it's a very active color. So there's nothing subtle about it because there's nothing subtle about the pollution problem that we're in right now. So it's really bright and bold. So that was definitely going on in the back of the head when I was trying to design the book.
I wanted to ask you before we head to break, Elizabeth, there was another image, bicycles with muscles growing on them. Can you talk about that and what you found as you were, again, going out with scientists? I think you're meeting every Sunday and you'd be looking at what was being brought out from the water. I wonder if you can describe that for our listeners.
Yeah, so that came from the Sunday cleanup that you mentioned, which is actually through the Fjord cleanup group. And they're not scientists, we're just everyone in the community. It's an international group of people that we all would meet up on Sundays and literally just fish trash out of the fjord. And it was really fun. I started early on. I think I found them on Instagram. And as soon as I met everyone through the group, everyone was just so wonderful. And we would get together and dive and have kayaks and fish all this stuff out of the fjord. But a lot of it was bicycles and scooters. So like those electrical scooters were ending up in the fjord. And it's really shocking to see those things. But also you start to see what starts growing on the man-made objects that enter the water. So like there's mussels, there's the barnacles, there's starfish, there's urchins. So like not only is the pollution affecting the water just by being there, but then things are starting to grow on them as well. So it creates this, again, another layer of a pollution problem. But oh my God, it was so great. The Fjord Cleanup Group is really amazing. I highly recommend checking them out on Instagram and on their website. They're awesome.
We're talking with Connecticut artist Elizabeth Ellenwood again here where we live about her book and upcoming photography exhibit, The Interweaving of the Synthetic and Natural World, looking at how plastic pollution impacts our oceans. You can preview some of her images and find more information at ctpublic.org/wherewelive. The book Liz produced is also linked on our website. We'll continue talking after a short break. What questions do you have for her? You can join us too, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up Monday, New Haven resident Winfred Rembert was a civil rights activist who survived a near lynching and spent 7 years in prison. He passed away last year. On the next Where We Live, we talk about his 2022 Pulitzer Prize winning biography, Chasing Me to My Grave, an artist's memoir of the Jim Crow South. That conversation Monday. Now, my guest today is Fulbright scholar and Connecticut Sea Grant recipient Elizabeth Ellenwood, who spent a fellowship year in Norway studying and photographing microplastic pollution found in oceans. It's the focus of a book and upcoming exhibit titled The Interweaving of the Synthetic and Natural World. Will be going on display at the Lexi von Schlipp Gallery at UConn's Avery Point, November 3rd. More information on our website, ctpublic.org/where we live. Elizabeth, your work has been described as alluring and disturbing. Your photographs illuminating in detail the reality of ocean pollution and the new worlds or new marine ecosystems created in its wake. I'm wondering if you can describe another piece that you photographed in the book. There's a 2-page spread. On the left, a photo of a small piece of bright white styrofoam on a mossy rock. And then on the right, there's what looks like a yellowish rock in a pile of what are unmistakably rocks. Is that styrofoam too? Tell us about this pair.
Yeah, so that one's really interesting because it is styrofoam, but it blends so perfectly in with the rest of the rocks, right? Like I remember standing on the beach, looking over and being like, oh, wow, that's a nice cluster of rocks. And then looking a little bit closer and a little bit closer and then poking it and being like, oh, you are not a rock. Like you are actually squishy. So it is this way that the pollution's becoming like hidden within the landscape as well. And actually, the introduction of the book has a piece written by Rebecca Altman, who's amazing. And she's like a plastic historian. And she writes about how you have to train your eye to start looking for these things. And you're going to mistake, bone for plastic and things like this. And just the way she writes about it is really, it's really fascinating, but I feel like it really hits true for how I feel when I'm looking for pollution on the beach, because it does tend to hide and you kind of have to get your eyes looking and thinking a little bit more critically, which is really what I hope my images do for other people as well. So they can start to see it as well when they're like out in the world, in the environment.
So you see this as a good example of how you want people to engage with the environment and also your work. Alan, can you hear me?
Yes, exactly. Oh, am I here?
Yep, we're good.
Okay.
Earlier I brought up how you went out with volunteers and when you were in Norway, and there'd be bicycles and scooters that were getting taken out of the fjord. And there was actually a local blogger in Connecticut who tweeted about how New Haven riverkeeper Peter Davis pulled out a vacuum cleaner out of the Quinnipiac River. And it had, quote, become like a little reef with barnacles and oysters encrusted on it and crabs living inside. And he thought about putting it back into the river because sometimes ecology, quote, is sometimes counterintuitive. So I wonder if you can respond to that when you think about how you observe these bikes in a similar condition.
Right. Yeah, that's something I definitely thought about. And I talked to Hans Peter about and other scientists of like, when do you stop removing the trash from the water if there is so much growth and so much life on it? The problem for the scooters, especially that we were finding, is they have batteries in them, right? So like the battery is a whole problem and it's leaching out into the water. So yeah, I mean, I definitely think there are moments where you can leave things if they're not going to harm the environment more.
You mentioned Hans Peter Arp earlier. Again, he's the chemistry professor you worked with at the Norwegian Geotechnical Institute, and his words are featured throughout this book that you produced. Tell us tell us again why this was such an important component, and how the book came together. Again, the words that you wanted to make sure that were highlighted with the photography captured.
Yeah, so when we started the book early on, we emailed back and forth some ideas, and I started sending like a rough layout of images that I wanted to work with. And then he started to do the writing component. But when he did the writing component, he sent me a Word document that had all of, like the paragraphs of his words. And I found myself like reading it, but then having trouble really focusing on it because there's so many really important elements that he talks about. So I kind of started to play around with the words and move them around spacing wise throughout the page. And I sent that to him as a draft to be like, okay, what if we start piecing down the thoughts that you're writing about so that people have more time to kind of digest not only the images, but also the words and the things that you're talking about, like the plastosphere and how things are interweaving. Because I think sometimes the science writing can be a little heavy. So sometimes we skip over it, right? We see it and we're like, okay, well, I know it's important, but it's a lot of information. So we kind of skip over the really dense paragraphs. So yeah, the more we started like kind of cutting it apart and playing with it, I think it really started to become more successful to work with both the images and the writing.
Can you read an excerpt for us?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Let me just get that. Okay. So, oops. This is kind of later on in the book. So we've already gone over quite a few different pollution problems, but this is more about the interweaving. Okay. Plastic does not accumulate ultimately as just debris that can be removed, but it also makes a hybrid of synthetic polymer breakdown particles and organic matter, like natural soil and sediment particles. At the molecular level, the microplastics, nanoplastics, and large molecules interweave with natural organic matter. The two essentially coalesce and become one. A new family of particles and macromolecules, not synthetic, not natural, but something in between, changing the chemistry of soil, sediments, and oceanic chemistry at the most fundamental level. The detritus of life mixes with the detritus of plastic to form something unique, a dendritic organoplastoid. What is unknown is if this could change essential processes like nutrient cycles and carbon pumps in the ocean. Could these dendritic organoplastoids make sediments and soils less fertile? Plastic interweaves with the organic matter. The biology grows on the plastic and becomes one with the plastic, leading to a potential future where organic matter is forever changed by being this hybrid. Our grandchildren's soil and seabed will no longer be our grandparents' soil and seabed, but something else, maybe benign, maybe very scary, a planetary threat.
Again, you're hearing Elizabeth Ellenwood, Here Where We Live, reading from the book, The Interweaving of the Synthetic and Natural World. That's a collaboration with her and Hans Peter Arp, the chemistry professor that she worked with at the Norwegian Geotechnical Institute. She's a photographer, and we've been talking about how she's been capturing plastic pollution, images of plastic pollution in our oceans, making people think more about the long-term impact of this. So this exhibit is coming up again November 3rd at UConn's Avery Point. You must be pretty excited, and do you anticipate a lot of people again asking you questions about not only your time in Norway, but the larger point that you're trying to make people think about in terms of our planet and what's happening to our oceans?
Yeah, I'm super excited, and it feels very special to have this exhibition at UConn Avery Point. Because it's such a special place. Also, it really, going to grad school at UConn, it also feels like really full circle, and that I get to celebrate this moment of doing this crazy thing of living in another country for a year, and being able to like be a fly on the wall and learn all of these things in the science lab. And I really hope that lots of people come and ask lots of questions, because I feel like there's so many more questions that can be asked, and that can start all these conversations of like, okay, like how can we individually help? How can we help more through our community, through anything from single-use plastics to other sustainable mindsets that we all can work together towards. So I think it would be really great to just keep these conversations going.
Given what you've observed, what changes have you made in your personal life, Elizabeth, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, no worries. I mean, I try to do the, even very basic things of like always remembering your bags when you go, like your, bags when you go to the grocery store or things like that. I always try to also say, like, it's a weird concept, but I always try to say I don't need a straw before the server walks away whenever they're trying to bring you something. But the biggest, I think, shift that I've had recently was I also attended a series of workshops by the Sustainable Darkroom over in England. And it was all about how you can start to use like household waste, like tea and coffee, as a part of your developing in the darkroom. So I'm really looking forward to start making developers and things out of like things that could go into the compost, right? So, and composting is a big thing I do as well. Actually, I bring it to my mother's house because she composts for me, which is awesome. So I know I haven't seen my mom in a while as my compost bin gets too full, and I'm like, oh, okay. But composting is great. And just using less materials than you think that you actually need. That switch in the brain is also really important. And that's something I've been trying to be better at. Yeah.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for all the time you've given us today on the show. Yeah. And congratulations.
Thank you so much. And I hope everyone can make the November 3rd opening from 5:30 to 7:30. I'll give an artist talk at 6:30. And this has been really lovely. So thank you so much, Lucy.
That's Elizabeth Ellenwood, an artist from Pawcatuck, Connecticut, whose latest work and upcoming exhibit is titled The Interweaving of the Synthetic and Natural World, going on display again at UConn's Avery Point. More information at our website, as well as some images that Elizabeth has captured, ctpublic.org/wherewelive. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchil. Today's show produced by Katie Pellico. Special thanks to Dylan Reyes. Have a great weekend.